Good morning. This is Cynthia Hutchison at Automation Alley. Thank you for joining us for the New Normal. This is episode 5 of our New Normal series. Today, we're going to be joined by Peter Marcatulio. Peter is the Vice President of Global Partnerships at SRI. I'll let him tell you more about SRI in a minute, but I want to tell you a couple things about Peter. First and foremost, he's an avid cyclist. I know this because of an experience we had in conversation last November. And again, Peter may defer telling you that, but anyway, he's an avid cyclist and got a lot of biking in over the weekend. He spent 20 years at SRI Tech Transition and Commercialization. He works closely with early research all the way to startup and products. And one of the things I find most fascinating is he works in helping researchers tease the saleable, marketable pieces out of a product, get the right parts out to market. He's been doing shepherding companies in this way for about 20 years, and the last of it's been at SRI. So I think I'll let Peter now tell you about SRI and its founding and what their role is. Peter, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, good morning, Cynthia. It's still morning there, right?
It is still morning. Oh, and welcome early morning to our Silicon Valley friends.
Yeah. So thanks for the intro. Let me just give you sort of a quick overview of SRI, the Stanford Research Institute. Many people more sort of commonly refer to us still by that name. We were founded by Stanford about 75 years ago with the express mission of helping research move from the labs to the marketplace. So, the whole concept of working with scientists, but also working with industry and sort of bridging those two was part of the reason that SRI was formed. Today, we have about 1,500 staff members, most of those PhDs or advanced degrees, working across a wide range of fields from biotech to, artificial intelligence, robotics, even education and training systems. In the last 10 or so years, we've also been very active in starting companies, spin-outs, some very well known like Intuitive Surgical in the robotic surgery space. But probably the most well-known one was a company called Siri that we created and then was eventually acquired by Apple and is now built into what we think of as sort of modern mobile devices. In terms of sort of our presence, we're based in Silicon Valley. We have a large research lab in Princeton as well, but also about a dozen other labs spread throughout the US in places like San Diego, Boulder, Tampa Bay, Boston, and right there in Ann Arbor, we have a growing group of researchers in the area of radar. With respect to the automotive industry, we played several roles over many decades of interaction in automotive, from sensors, very, very early research in LiDAR, radar, camera systems. We've worked recently in ADAS in sort of bringing together some of those sensors with AI and autonomous systems. We've worked on coatings and materials. We've worked on, obviously, virtual assistants in the sort of automotive space. And more recently in things like manufacturing, process automation, robotic process automation, knowledge capture, all those kinds of areas that are now sort of the focus of some of the discussion for today.
Wonderful, thank you. We're going to be talking today, like the series does, about new normal. What's the normal look like? How are things different post-COVID from pre-COVID? And how are we going to work, in tandem going forward with living alongside COVID, because COVID-19 is not going away anytime soon. And we want to talk about how technology has made some of the changes impact technological advancement and the pace at which things are changing. When SRI joined us at Integrate last year, we heard a lot of manufacturers talking about they need to see an ROI before implementing any Industry 4.0 technologies. And that's been a barrier and created a pretty significant amount of inertia sometimes. And we go through a variety of conversations about that whether it's, pilot paralysis or pilot purgatory, but we get stuck there. So when you have something like COVID happen, how did this pandemic maybe change perspective on that or alter the cadence with which we're going to see adaptation of new technologies?
Well, I think it's probably a little bit of both. So some of the perspective is going to be a change in the kinds of things that you're trying to do with Industry 4.0, the kinds of data that in Industry 4.0 is really trying to do a mix of digital systems with physical systems, right? And so you have this sort of mix of what's happening in your factory or even in your entire supply chain, and trying to capture that digitally and analyze that to improve those processes. So at the highest level, that's probably the rationale, the reason for implementing it doesn't really change. Some of the focus areas may change, and certainly some of the cadence and pace may accelerate certain aspects of it, especially as it comes to areas like safety, cleanliness, operator distance, those kinds of aspects. I think there's also going to be aspects in the supply chain. We've seen significant supply chain disruptions in the recent past, and I think those are going to be reevaluated. How much inventory, where the inventory is, when it gets used, how it gets through the system. I think all those are going to be reevaluated. Part of the challenge, I'm sorry, go ahead, Cynthia.
When you and I talked last Friday, one of the things we talked about is getting people to collaborate. How do you get people to collaborate in a competitive fields, but in a non-competitive environment? The safe piece of work, collaboration. Nobody knows that better than people who work with startup companies, because there's so much collaboration involved that we know about and don't know about. And you gave a phenomenal analogy to the venture capital industry. So if you would talk about that, I think that really was helpful for me.
So I think if we step back and look at Industry 4.0, it was really a sort of government-driven initiative in Germany, and there are similar initiatives in places like China and Japan. And those initiatives, at the government levels, tend to be academically focused with some industry involvement, but really more involvement from the traditional, just pure research community. What we look for, I think, a little bit differently in the US is what are some different models that allow us to collaborate without having to have sort of a government overlay, which is difficult for people to interact with. Even large companies sometimes struggle to participate in some of these government programs. And so I look at a few models, and one model that sort of makes a lot of sense, especially when you have a significant amount of risk and you don't have a real crystal ball as to what the outcomes will look like, is something like the venture capital model. And what's interesting about the venture capital model is they expect a significant amount of failure, right? So about 20% of startups actually succeed to a point where they're making money for the investors as well as for themselves. Maybe another 10, 20% are sort of hovering, and then most of them fail. And so the venture capital model is really about building a portfolio across those risks and then spreading that risk across multiple organizations. You have, sort of the managing partners that are identifying these different elements that go into the portfolio, and then you have the limited partners, the investors in the fund, and they can have multiple levels of participation, but their risk is spread across that entire fund, and so they're getting the benefit of the upside, but they're not taking the full hit of those downsides. And if you look at that model, the high payoff ones are impactful enough that they make up for whatever losses there might be, right? And so there are many elements to that model. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to stop you for a second where I think that people might have a question. So I want you to also overlay this into like a hypothetical, and we'll do automotive. Detroit's, Michigan's much more than automotive, but we'll stick with that because it's so well known as an analogy here. So where's the managing partner? How do those levels line up with an OEM, a tier one?
Right. So what you want to find in a managing partner is an organization that can create a series of theses, ideas, concepts of where that impact might be. And that could be either typically it's not an academic institution. It's usually somebody who's either closely associated with the industry or has some understanding of the industry, or comes at it from a different perspective. Maybe a place like an SRI or an automotive valley, right? Where we don't have a significant stake in any one outcome. We're just looking for what the best possible outcomes might be, right? So that could be the sort of managing partner kind of concept. And then the limiteds would be participants from the industry, right? So they could be OEMs, tier ones, tier twos. And again, there could be different levels of participation. But what's different about the venture model is those limited partners often have a very active role in making decisions about what kinds of investments are made, where those investments are made, and how organizations partner within those different projects or programs. The other element that I really like about the venture model is that it's very quick to make decisions. As things succeed, they double down and invest and expand. As things are not succeeding, they're able to sort of prune those and limit the losses, if you want to think of it that way, or the downside, right? So fast decisions to yes, even faster decisions to no. And that's something that is often not found in large government programs and even in some large companies where there's, a long process to get something kicked off and an even longer process to sort of kill it.
Can you give me a couple real examples of things like this?
In terms of, well, there aren't any direct examples that would apply to this use case, but again, any large fund would be an example where you might have a single fund that's investing in, let's say, AI for autonomous vehicles, and they'll invest in a company that's focused on sensors. They'll invest in a company that's focused on maybe accelerating the underlying AI. They may invest in another company that is focusing on integrating different portions of the system. Each one of those carries a certain amount of risk, right? And they really don't have a crystal ball. They don't know if one or the other is going to have the greatest impact, but they're placing enough bets across that field that the ones that succeed are going to have a big success, right? And then they understand. People think about, failure. It's really not failure, it's learning, right? So each one of these that isn't successful is an opportunity to learn why it wasn't successful and sort of reevaluate the thesis. And again, double down on those areas that are going to show some payoff.
So if we had something, and I'm going to use a hypothetical. So if Automation Alley convened a group of people with SRI, and they were all from automotive industry at those varying levels, OEM, tier 1, tier 2, and they were looking at how a particular technology was going to impact something in the autonomous vehicle. Without betraying each of their specific applications and how they're going to use it, they would share and find the success or failure of a certain technology. And it enables particularly the small, I think about the smaller companies, to take a risk that they couldn't afford to take on their own.
Yeah.
Is that...
I think that's a good description, and think of each one of these as sort of small experiments, proof of concepts, and they can start small and scale again. And what you'd want to do is find a partner for each one. So they aren't done in a purely academic or theoretical setting. They're actually done in conjunction with somebody's, in the case of ADAS, maybe somebody's vehicle development, or in the case of manufacturing in a real factory, right? So you would set up a proof of concept experiment with a partner, but the results of that would be shared across the larger group, at least the key findings, maybe some new aspect of technology or some new process that was developed.
Is this a great time to look at this? Because does not the COVID mitigation, which is really what we're talking about, right, time require all of a sudden companies have to collaborate? Because essentially companies who were resistant or didn't have the funding, didn't have the money, didn't have the time, didn't have the planning time to move into a new technology, now can't reopen their doors unless they take certain steps, all of which are impacted by technologies that are reusable and extendable and expandable within their industry long after it's just for contact tracing. How does that change the window of opportunity?
I think you raise a really good point. And, what's changed today is that, there may be some competitive advantages by doing something yourself. But in this environment, if everybody isn't opening up and everybody isn't participating and delivering, the supply chain gets broken. And we've already seen that, right? So there's a benefit to having, sort of a more collaborative approach, if for no other reason than just to ensure that, everybody is able to participate and be part of that supply chain again, right? So if you're finding tools and techniques that allow one factory to open at some rate, you're going to want to share that so that everybody else's factory can open, so that they can all work together, right? And eventually get back up to the volumes that they saw pre-COVID.
So what specific technology, talk to me a little bit about the technologies that you think are critical for a safe return to manufacturing.
Right. So
to success.
Yeah, and maybe before I jump there, something
Yeah.
a point I wanted to make, which is that the venture capital model is very market driven, right? So this isn't just, it's not about technology for the sake of technology or invention or for the sake of invention. It is about meeting and solving a key market demand and constantly testing whether you are achieving that against the market, not against, some academic pursuit that is worthwhile but may not actually have a direct impact on the market. In terms of specific technologies, I mean, there's when we think of clean tech in the past, we were thinking about green. I think in terms of what we think about clean tech today, we're thinking about literally cleaning.
Clean.
So getting things clean. So I think there are a number of initiatives. You've seen press releases and things from organizations trying to ensure that the equipment, the environment, the air, but the things that they touch is up to a level of cleanliness that allows for or minimizes the chance that you're spreading the disease. And so I think there's a whole thrust in a new level of cleanliness. And that could be new materials, but also different tools and methods for applying existing techniques to robotics, but also areas like using AI and cameras to identify, track, and analyze how people are moving through an environment, how they might be interacting with each other, and how to minimize some of those points where you have the greatest risk. Right? So those technologies are certainly increasing. We've seen actually even before COVID where there was a desire to really understand, and again, sort of in an industry 4.0 context, really understand what was happening at all of the different interfaces across an operation, a manufacturing operation. And now those are even more critical because those interfaces are where you have the risks for disease spread.
Right. The very strength of collaboration that we've become accustomed to being in person with meetings is now kind of our weakness and the thing we need to work our way around.
Right. So think of it as contact tracing throughout the supply chain, right?
Yes. Yeah, it is contact tracing throughout the supply chain. And I'm a big fan of, protecting the supply chain. That's a part of what I love about my job is, one of the things we do at Automation is we're very committed to protecting the entire supply chain because, we work with the OEMs all the way down to the smallest companies, and we want to make sure the small companies have a chance to stay in business. Keeping people in business is our business. So finding the strategies that do that are somewhat affordable. And that's why I talk about the ROI thing is I think that people are sometimes apprehensive about what it's going to take to make this transition. But right now, as we're forced into an Industry 4.0 environment, even if we weren't. I spoke yesterday with an academic institution that told me they had many conversations prior to COVID about whether or not they could take, how much content could go to online. And they had numbers that were nowhere near 100%. And they ended up transforming 1,600 courses to online only in 10 days. And they're, back up and running. And now they're looking at the billions of square foot of space they have and wondering how much of that they'll need to retain long-term. Right. So it's interesting, forced exercise for some people. And as horrific as it's been, it has been a forced exercise in the possible, envisioning the possible.
So certainly things like utilization, space, the ability to capture and transfer information and knowledge. There's one thing to be able to capture data in a document and send somebody a document. It's much, much more complex to transfer deep knowledge, especially knowledge gained on things like a piece of equipment or a setup or some operation that maybe is very specialized. And those are the kinds of things that we're going to be exploring as we move forward.
Well, in my work, part of my role here, I get to spend a fair amount of time working with the World Economic Forum, other advanced manufacturing hubs around the globe, and particularly in Korea, their COVID mitigation was quick and thorough, in that their contact tracing is quite amazing. Now, I understand that their privacy rules are so variable across national borders that maybe the US won't tolerate some of that, but it was very interesting to find out how quickly they were able to track and trace and compartmentalize and, keep people safe. So what can we do as we're talking about that? Tell me a little bit about what a flexible manufacturing line would look like in a factory today.
Right. So I think flexible carries a lot of different connotations. And so we have to think about what we mean by flexibility. Is it the ability to change over from one product to the other quickly? Is it the ability to have a variety of different items that are able to be produced on a single line? Is it the ability to scale up and scale down? Right. So all of those are elements of flexibility. There's also sort of an industry perception that we have to get over, that flexibility means slow, or that it means that it's just manual and you can't automate and get some efficiencies. And so what we really look at in flexibility is sort of a combination of all of those, but really help define it for each organization. So what does flexibility mean for them? And flexibility overall should allow a tangible result, a tangible ROI when you implement that flexibility. So that, again, can mean better utilization, faster changeover. We need to identify some of those key KPIs and then build flexibility to match those KPIs. And again, this can't be an academic exercise, flexibility for the sake of flexibility. It needs to have real concrete results that can be measured and implemented, across a variety of organizations. When we look at flexibility, we see a lot of people pushing automation techniques, and some of the challenges there is that there's sort of a long ramp up time, right? So part of what we look at as flexibility is how do we mix automation with what is probably the most flexible system, which is human operators, right? So people are able to change tasks very rapidly. Most autonomous systems are not. So one of the things that we're looking at is trying to study the hybrid systems, and then the interaction, sometimes called cobots, the interaction between people and machines, to sort of improve some of that flexibility. And where you can start, maybe you start a process that's more manual and then you gradually automate it, and then you're able to move those operators onto a new process, and again, evaluate it, measure it, and then start to automate it. Right? So I think there's multiple definitions, but they really all start with trying to find the best possible mix of tools and systems to increase your overall efficiency.
Interesting. Talk to me a little bit, talk to us a little bit about the need for knowledge capture.
Yeah, so that, flexibility, again, is a good example. We see a lot of cases, especially in aging populations, like in Asia, where you have expertise with certain pieces of equipment or with certain processes, and that expertise is aging out. And so one of the things that we've done recently is work with companies to try to deeply understand and capture that sort of, not the explicit knowledge, the things that are written down, but the implicit knowledge, the nudge that they give to the piece of equipment to get it working or to get it calibrated. When they can start understanding that something is out of spec or needs maintenance or repair. There are some very subtle things that people do, whether it's audio or visual. What we're trying to do is capture all of that explicit knowledge, tie it together with the implicit knowledge, those things that they've learned over their career, and then provide that in a format, whether that's augmented reality, virtual reality, videos, so that the next person can now very rapidly get up to speed. And by person, it could be an operator, but it could also be somebody who's setting up a piece of equipment or a robot in a factory. It's all of those things.
That's interesting because we talk about, predictive maintenance and how wonderful predictive maintenance is, but you're saying that the predictive maintenance is really good, but the predictive maintenance overlaid with the person who has expertise in predictive maintenance is better because there's a level of implicit knowledge
Sure.
that layers on top of the explicit knowledge.
In fact, a lot of predictive maintenance, at least the first generation of the sort of autonomous systems, were based on feedback that they got from operators, right? So what sound are you hearing? And then can we capture that sound, classify it, and then use it to sort of understand when this piece of equipment may require some maintenance.
It's really wonderful. How, we talk about workforce, and the workforce conversations changed so dramatically it's quite breathtaking. You know, everybody here knows that 5 months ago, we were talking about the huge worker shortage we had across the US, and now we've got a big unemployment problem. But the training, the opportunities and the individuals available to fit them are kind of not hitting.
Not aligned, yeah.
What do we need to do, and how are we going to retrain people to get them safe, but also into the right buckets, if you will?
Well, again, I think some of this work in the knowledge capture and transfer is key to that, right? So what we have is a misalignment of skills in many respects to what's required versus what people have done in the past. And so one way to rapidly get them trained to perform new skills or work on new pieces of equipment is to sort of embed this knowledge capture and transfer. And we've done projects where that can be done with virtual reality. So you capture a process in tremendous detail, and then you provide that to somebody to train on virtually, or you put them in the environment with things like augmented reality and guide them through that process. So you use things like virtual assistants and visual guides that are based on what we've captured from the experts to sort of bring them up to speed more rapidly. And we found it to be very effective. In one case, we were transitioning a gold process from a factory in Japan to a factory in the US that had a different level of automation. So we had to translate between a highly automated process to a semi-automated process to Eastern Europe and Mexico, where it was very little automation, right? All using the same basic techniques, modified for each environment that it went into.
So actually, what you just described is the same kind of thing that we would want to be able to, if we had a consortium, if you will,
yeah,
and we're running it like the VC model, an OEM, a tier 1, a tier 2, and a very small supplier, 3 and below, would be almost the description you just had of different nations with different levels of existing legacy environments.
Yeah, and then how do you translate those from the highly sophisticated, highly automated environment that may be a little bit less flexible to the lower tiers where you want to be able to have multiple suppliers performing multiple tasks that can be a little bit more agile in responding to the requirements up the chain.
As you talked about all this multinational work that you do, and I know that SRI does a lot of global work. We haven't talked about this before, but what do you see happening with that global supply chain in terms of some kind of reallocation, or how complex is it? We talk about reshoring, just move it back from China, put it back in the US. How complex is that in reality?
Well, I think especially as you move further down the supply chain, it becomes more and more complex, right? So what we see in places like China is the ability to very rapidly stand up very low tier manufacturing to be able to then supply the next level to then get up to the ultimate, assembly and manufacturing at the higher level, right? And it's that part of that sort of lower level, and you see similar things in Germany with small to mid-sized businesses that are able to change over very rapidly in what they're doing and supply further up the chain. And I think part of that is what's missing in the US as we think about reshoring. We have fundamental components and lower tier parts and items that are hard to reshore, or that there isn't the capacity here. And so again, part of that knowledge capture and transfer is, can we duplicate some of those elements here in when we try to reshore, or in North America, or wherever makes the most sense, so that we minimize those disruptions to the supply chain and are able to, again, pivot, be a little bit more agile than we have been in the past.
Right. I think this is a very interesting exposure, if you will. It laid bare some of the faults in the supply chain. We all know all chains are only as strong as the weakest link, and everybody knows that. But somehow this has created a very, very bold look at that supply chain with a magnifying glass, and we're seeing those gaps and trying to find some solutions. it's exciting for Automation Alley in Troy, Michigan to work with SRI out of Silicon Valley and get the kind of knowledge you have and the opportunity for our member companies to get to know the same level of expertise that is global and have access to it through us. So I want to thank you, Peter, for your time. I know that my notes tell me that if you want to get a hold of Peter and want to learn more about it, just simply go to petermarcatulio@sri.com. So you're welcome to do that. But Marcatulio is a long name, and you're also welcome to reach out to us here at Automation Alley, and we will connect you. And I'm sure you will be at Integrate. So November 9th and 10th, we're at Integrate in Detroit. You can meet with SRI there too as well. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Cynthia.